I had the first post hole half drilled into the ground when I heard the unmistakable sound of angry flip-flops slapping pavement. "Kenton, what do you think you're doing?" came the voice of Deborah Whitmore, president of the Oak Hollow HOA and self-declared empress of all things petty. I stood up, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and turned around, still holding the power auger. "Building a fence," I said. "On your own," she barked, her perfectly manicured hand on her hip. "Without HOA approval, it's on my land," I shot back, already tired of her nonsense. "This is a shared green space," she snapped, gesturing wildly at the patch of overgrown weeds and dead grass between my house and the retention pond. I dropped the auger. "No, Deb, it's not. I had the property surveyed last month. The stakes are right there. It's well within my lot line." Deborah stomped over, heels now clicking like a metronome of entitlement. Her over-bleached hair bounced with every furious step. "You can't just decide to build whatever you want. This neighborhood has rules. And those rules don't apply to land I own," I said, pointing to the bright orange survey tape wrapped around the metal stakes. "You can't claim my backyard just because you want a better walking path for your dog." She narrowed her eyes, then pulled out her phone. "You're leaving me no choice," she said, tapping rapidly. "You're violating HOA standards and building without permission." I laughed. "You're seriously calling 911? She didn't answer. But 30 minutes later, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw a sheriff's SUV pull up. The deputy stepped out, sunglasses low on his nose, already looking more amused than concerned. "You Kenton Clarke?" the deputy asked. "Yep," I said. Deborah marched toward him like she was reporting a kidnapping. "Officer, he's putting up a fence without HOA approval. That's a violation of our bylaws, and he's encroaching on community property." The deputy tilted his head. "Is that true?" he asked me. I pulled the rolled-up survey from my toolbox, handed it over, and pointed to the metal stakes in the ground. "Had it officially surveyed last month. County records match it. That land's mine." The deputy looked over the document, then at the stakes, then back at me. Then he let out a loud laugh. "Lady," he said, turning to Deborah, "you called 911 over a guy building a fence on his own property." Deborah's face flushed red. "This is a matter of community standards." "No, ma'am," the deputy said. "This is a matter for your HOA newsletter, not emergency services. You're just going to let him build it." The deputy looked at me, then back at her. "Unless you've got a warrant or a badge I don't know about, that man can build whatever he wants on his land." Deborah's jaw dropped. The deputy handed me back the survey and walked off chuckling, shaking his head. I got back to work, but I knew this wasn't over. Not with Deborah Whitmore. Not by a long shot. The fence was finished by Saturday. A clean, cedar privacy barrier that ran in a straight line along the surveyed boundary, sealing off the back corner of my yard from what used to be an unofficial dog walking cut through. I installed a latched gate as a courtesy, but kept it locked. The sun was barely rising on Sunday, and I was already outside, sipping coffee, when I spotted a trio of HOA board members standing in a tight circle at the far edge of the fence, talking in low voices. Deborah wasn't with them, but her hand-picked vice president, Greg Talbot, kept glancing toward my house like I owed him money. I ignored them and went back inside. By Tuesday, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No postage, just a folded note tucked into an envelope stamped with the Oak Hollow HOA logo. It was printed on fancy linen paper, the kind people use when they want to seem more official than they are. The letter claimed I had breached Section 8.4, Visual Harmony and Shared Aesthetic Guidelines, and that I had 7 days to remove the fence or face escalating fines. I scanned the document twice. There was no mention of property lines, no acknowledgement of the county survey, and no citation of any law or ordinance. Just vague references to community cohesion and visual integrity. I wasn't surprised. Deborah had always been better at sounding important than being right. I dropped the letter into a drawer and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my cousin Valerie. She was a municipal code compliance officer in a nearby city, and had a knack for reading between the lines of HOA nonsense. "Sounds like they're bluffing," she said after I forwarded her the letter. "But if they push it, file a complaint with the county. Let me know if it escalates." It did. Thursday morning, I spotted a man in a neon vest walking the perimeter of my yard with a clipboard. When I stepped outside to confront him, he introduced himself as a contractor hired by the HOA to document unauthorized changes to shared land. "You're on private property," I said. "I was told this is common space," he replied without looking up. "Who told you that, HOA president?" he said, scribbling something on his form. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out a laminated copy of the survey and handed it to him. He scanned it, blinked, then scratched out whatever he had just written. "Well," he said, handing it back, "this changes things. I'll report it as a boundary misunderstanding." "You'll report it as what it is, trespassing," I said. "And you'll leave, now." He didn't argue, just packed up his clipboard and walked off, muttering under his breath, I'd had enough. That night, I went online and filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office, attaching the survey, photos of the fence, and a digital copy of the letter from the HOA. I also sent a copy to the State Attorney General's HOA Oversight Division, just to be thorough. Valerie had warned me that the HOA's next move would probably be financial. She was right. By the weekend, I'd received a new notice, this one claiming I now owed over $800 in administrative penalties for non-compliance. They tacked on a daily fine and even threatened a lien against my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. I was sitting in my garage, rereading the notice, when my neighbor, Joe, wandered over. He was a retired firefighter with a bad knee and a gift for minding his own business until now. "You get one of these too?" he asked, holding up an identical envelope. "They fined you?" I asked. "For a shed I've had since '09, he said. "Guess they're going after everybody now." I invited him inside and showed him my documentation. When he saw the survey, he whistled. "They know they can't win this, right? They're hoping I'll cave before I make trouble," Joe laughed. "They picked the wrong guy." By Monday, the situation had snowballed. 5 other neighbors had received similar notices, each tied to minor infractions that had never been enforced before. A basketball hoop, a garden bed, a flagpole. It was clear what was happening. The HOA was retaliating against anyone who sided with me, trying to isolate me and pressure the others into silence. I decided it was time to go public. That evening, I emailed every homeowner in Oak Hollow. I attached the survey, the original fine notice, and the photos proving the fence was on private property. I also included a link to the county complaint form and the contact information for the Attorney General's office. I ended with a simple message: if they can do this to me over a fence, they can do it to you over anything. The response was immediate. By the next afternoon, over 20 residents had submitted their own complaints. A few even banded together to request a full audit of the HOA's finances and enforcement history. That's when things got really interesting. It turned out the HOA had been collecting beautification fees for the past 3 years' money that was supposed to go toward landscaping improvements. But the landscapers hadn't been paid in over 6 months, and the only recent expense listed in the financial report was a $5,000 consulting fee paid to a company owned by Deborah's cousin. We had her. I forwarded everything to the county investigator handling my complaint. 2 days later, I got a call. Deborah and the HOA treasurer were being formally notified of a pending investigation into financial misconduct and abuse of authority. The county would be sending an enforcement officer to review the association's books. The very next morning, a U-Haul appeared in front of Deborah's house. She wasn't outside, but movers were loading boxes like their lives depended on it. Greg Talbot showed up around noon, looking pale and nervous. He tried to wave at me, but I didn't return it. He walked over anyway. "Look, Kenton," he said, hands jammed in his pockets. "This whole thing got out of hand. Maybe we can work something out." I raised an eyebrow. You offering to pay me back the $800 your board tried to extort? He didn't answer. Didn't think so, I said and walked back inside. Later that week, a special meeting was called. Over half the neighborhood showed up. With the pressure mounting and the investigation underway, Deborah officially resigned. Greg stepped down shortly after. A temporary board was voted in real neighbors this time, not control freaks with agendas. The new board's first motion: reimburse every homeowner who'd received bogus fines in the past year. Their second: an emergency amendment that stripped the board of the power to issue penalties without documented legal justification and majority vote from a neutral review committee. I didn't run for a seat. I didn't need to. The fence stood exactly where I built it, untouched, solid, mine. And for the first time since I moved into Oak Hollow, the place actually felt like a neighborhood. The first board meeting under the interim committee was scheduled for a Thursday evening, held in the elementary school gymnasium. For the first time in Oak Hollow history, every folding chair was filled. Some neighbors even stood along the walls or sat cross-legged near the bleachers. A whiteboard with a handwritten agenda leaned against the stage. I sat near the back, arms crossed, keeping quiet. I wasn't there to talk. I was there to listen. The new chairperson, a retired teacher named Marla Gaines, opened the meeting with a calm authority that immediately hushed the room. She introduced the committee, noted the pending investigation, and laid out the night's goals: transparency, restructuring, and restoring trust. Her tone struck a balance between seriousness and unity. Then she opened the floor. "I'd like to speak," said a man I didn't recognize. He stood near the front, holding a manila folder. "I'm Rafael Mendoza. My wife and I live on Sycamore Lane." He stepped forward and opened the folder. 2 weeks ago, I found a letter taped to our door. It claimed we owed $600 for unauthorized exterior modifications. He held it up. The photo attached was of a bird bath. My wife's grandmother gave it to her. It's been there for 5 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's not the problem," he continued. "The problem is that I checked the HOA's financial reports. That fine was deposited into a private account. Not the shared fund. The routing number doesn't match." The air in the room shifted. Marla looked over her glasses. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes," Raphael said, handing her a printed bank statement and photocopy of the letter. A woman near the front row stood abruptly. "We had the same thing happen. We were fined for having solar lights. The check we wrote never showed up on the annual ledger." That was the moment it all broke open. Over the next 40 minutes, more than a dozen residents stepped forward with similar stories. Unjustified fines, payments that vanished, letters that looked official but weren't postmarked. One neighbor, a tax accountant named Lisa, said she'd analyzed the last 2 years of HOA expenses and found over $9,000 categorized as consulting with no invoices to back them. Then came the real bombshell. A soft-spoken older man named Walter, who lived on the corner lot with the giant oak tree, stood with a folder so thick the rubber band holding it closed had snapped. He cleared his throat. "I used to work for the county auditor's office," he said. "Retired last year. I've been watching this neighborhood's financial trends for months. I started digging after they tried to fine me for an invisible fence I never installed." He opened the folder and began passing out copies of what he'd found. "There's evidence that Deborah Whitmore, Greg Talbot, and the treasurer, Naomi Keene, created a shell company registered under a P.O. box in another county. That company was awarded multiple maintenance contracts, but there are no records of any work being done. The payments, however, were very real." Gasps and raised voices surged around the room. Walter continued. "The company was registered under Naomi's maiden name. I verified the address. It's a UPS store box. This wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate." Marla stood slowly. "Walter, are you saying they embezzled funds?" Walter looked up. "I'm saying they committed fraud, and I already gave everything to the district attorney's office." The room erupted. 2 people clapped. Others yelled questions. Someone shouted that they wanted their money back. Marla banged a gavel until things settled. "Effective immediately," she said. "The committee will freeze all outgoing funds and request a third-party audit. If the DA finds grounds for criminal charges, the HOA's liability insurance may be used to reimburse residents. We'll also review all penalties issued during the last 3 years." After the meeting, people lingered in the parking lot, huddling in tight groups, comparing notes and digging through their own HOA letters. I leaned against my truck watching until Raphael approached. "Thanks for what you did," he said. "It started with your fence. If you hadn't stood your ground, none of this would have come to light." "I just didn't want people walking their dogs through my yard," I said, half joking. "You did more than that," he said, then walked off. The next morning, 2 unmarked sedans pulled up in front of Deborah's house. Plainclothes investigators entered with clipboards and body cameras. By noon, Greg Talbot's SUV had been towed from his driveway. Naomi's home had a notice taped to the door: "Property subject to forensic financial investigation." That afternoon, I got a call from the district attorney's office. A young investigator named Andrea Holt asked if I could come in to give a statement about the original survey, the 911 call, and the timeline of events. At her office, I handed over every document. I had: the survey, photos, HOA letters, the sheriff's incident report. Andrea was methodical, asking short, precise questions, cross-checking everything with what they already had. "We've established a pattern," she said, flipping through my documents. "They used false compliance violations to justify fines, then redirected those payments to personal accounts. It's textbook wire fraud. If we confirm the amounts, we're looking at felony charges." I nodded, not quite satisfied yet. "What happens next?" "They'll be arraigned within the week. We've already frozen the accounts. If the judge agrees, we'll seize the assets under restitution statutes." By Thursday, it was all over the local news. The headline ran across the bottom of the screen during the evening weather: "HOA leaders indicted in Oak Hollow fraud scheme." Deborah, Greg, and Naomi were all facing multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of fiduciary responsibilities. They had been released on bond, but a court date was already scheduled. The footage showed them walking out of the courthouse, stone-faced and silent. Back in Oak Hollow, things changed fast. The interim board became permanent through a unanimous vote. Marla led the charge to implement sweeping reforms: online access to financial records, all enforcement actions requiring photographic evidence and third-party review, a resident-elected compliance officer, and a cap on discretionary spending without a vote. The neighborhood newsletter returned this time. It was actually informative. A local kid built a website with a portal for residents to submit questions and vote on proposals. The committee even held a summer barbecue in the park next to the pond, the same one Deborah once tried to declare exclusive HOA green space. I brought sweet tea and a folding table. Walter brought copies of the audit summary and passed them out with a big grin. People laughed, talked. No one mentioned fences. No one looked over their shoulders. The place felt lighter, like a spell had been broken around dusk. Joe wandered over with a plate of ribs. "You see the news?" he asked. I did. They're saying restitution might cover almost 70% of what was stolen. "Not bad for a bunch of bird baths and basketball hoops," I said. He laughed, then nodded toward my fence. "Still standing. Of course it is." Joe took a bite of rib, chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Funny how something that small kicked off something this big." I looked out over the crowd: kids playing tag, neighbors chatting, someone setting up a cornhole board, and said, "It wasn't small. It was mine." A month after the barbecue, Marla called me on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice sounded steadier than it had during those first chaotic meetings, but there was a distinct edge of urgency. "Kenton," she said, "we need to talk, privately." I drove over to her place after work. She lived on a quiet cul-de-sac a few blocks from the pond. Her house was modest, with a porch swing and a row of potted herbs that gave the air a faint scent of rosemary. She greeted me at the door with a manila envelope under her arm. Inside, she led me to the dining room where the table was already set with 2 glasses of iced tea and a stack of printed documents. "I didn't call you here as the chair," she said, sliding the envelope toward me. "I'm calling you as a concerned neighbor." I opened it and scanned the first page. It was a receipt dated nearly 10 months back for a landscaping job that had never taken place. Services included pond bank restoration, erosion control netting, and native plant installation. The total, just under $28,000. "They submitted this to the HOA accounting system," she said, tapping the page. "Paid in full. But nothing was done, not a single plant. I walked the pond myself last night." I flipped to the next page. It was a business registration for a company called Green Horizon Environmental Services. The listed contact was a man named Alan Keene. "Naomi's husband," I said, eyebrows lifting. "Exactly. This wasn't in Walter's audit." It was buried under a secondary vendor list they labeled as seasonal partnerships. I only found it because I was going through old emails from the treasurer account. "It's another shell," I said. "They created a fake company to siphon more money." Marla nodded. "And this one crossed into county funds. They used grant money from a shared community beautification program. They forged signatures on the reimbursement application." I stood up for a moment, running a hand through my hair. "That's federal. Which is why I've already contacted the state auditor," she said. "But the thing is, they'll move slow. There's protocol, red tape. I want this expedited." I looked at her. "You want me to talk to someone? I heard you have a cousin in the DA's office." "The one handling Deborah's case." "Not exactly a cousin," I said, "but close enough." When I got back home, I pulled up the contact list and found Andrea's number. She answered on the second ring. "Clarke," she said, "I was hoping you'd call. We've been digging deeper into the HOA accounts. You wouldn't believe how many layers they built." I told her about the landscaping invoice and the forged grant application. There was a pause on the other end. "That's not just fraud. That's misappropriation of public funds. We can bring in the state's Financial Crimes Division." "Good," I said. "How long will that take?" "Not long. They've been waiting for something actionable beyond internal HOA corruption." 2 weeks later, unmarked vehicles swarmed Naomi's house just after dawn. This time, it wasn't just investigators, it was state agents in dark jackets with clipboards and search warrants. They carried sealed evidence bags and portable scanners. By 8, they'd confiscated 2 desktops, a filing cabinet, and a box of external hard drives. Naomi and her husband were led out the front door quietly, without cuffs, but with the unmistakable posture of people who knew what was coming. News vans showed up by 10. The story broke by lunch. The headline read, "HOA funds tied to state grant fraud couple under investigation for embezzlement and forgery." The grant office released a statement confirming that the documents submitted by Green Horizon Environmental Services had been falsified. The signature of the county liaison had been expertly traced from an old PDF, but the watermark on the form gave it away. It was from an outdated version that had been replaced 2 years earlier. Andrea called me that evening. "We're filing for a full injunction," she said. "If approved, it'll allow the court to seize every asset tied to the company and freeze any account it touched. That includes the HOA's operating budget during the year they submitted the application. What happens to the neighborhood? The state will appoint a financial custodian," she said. "Temporarily, they'll oversee all financial operations and help the board rebuild from scratch." I let out a breath. "That's big." "It is, and you were the first domino, Kenton. This all started with a fence." The injunction was granted 2 days later. A representative from the state controller's office arrived with a small team and set up shop in the HOA community room. They hung a laminated sign on the door. "Temporarily under state review, all meetings suspended until further notice." Despite the disruption, No one complained. Most residents were relieved. Some even left thank you notes on Marla's porch. One neighbor brought her a pie with HOA MVP written in frosting. At the next public hearing hosted not by the HOA, but by the state's Community Oversight Division, residents were invited to speak about their experiences. I wasn't planning to talk, but when they called my name, I stood. I didn't set out to challenge the HOA, I said. I just wanted to build a fence on my property, but what started as a boundary dispute exposed something far worse. They weren't just overreaching, they were stealing. And they were doing it in a way that made people feel powerless. The room was silent. But we weren't powerless, we had each other, we had records, and most importantly, we had the will to push back. When I sat down, a few people clapped, then more, then nearly everyone. The investigation dragged on for several more months, but the outcome was decisive. Deborah, Greg, Naomi, and Alan were all indicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of public funds. The evidence was overwhelming. During sentencing, the judge didn't mince words. This wasn't a case of poor management, he said. This was calculated theft under the guise of community leadership. The defendants abused the trust of their neighbors for personal gain, and they will be held fully accountable. All four were sentenced to varying terms in state prison, with restitution orders attached. The court also ruled that any property acquired using HOA funds would be liquidated and returned to the association's budget. The state custodian stayed on for another 6 months to oversee the restoration of finances. With their help, the board rewrote the bylaws, added mandatory third-party audits, and created a rotating compliance review panel that included at least 3 non-board members. At the next election, Marla declined to run again. I never wanted to lead, she told me. I just wanted to live in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other. A few weeks later, I noticed something new in her front yard, a small wooden bench under the shade of her maple tree. On it, a plaque read, "For those who kept asking questions." Life in Oak Hollow settled into something new, not perfect but honest. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk without getting notes about helmet colors. People planted gardens without worrying about mulch color violations. The newsletter stopped printing rules and started listing birthdays and lost pets, and my fence still standing. Still locked. But now, no one even looked at it twice. One afternoon, Joe walked by with his dog and stopped near the gate. "You ever think about taking it down?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nope, not because I need it, just to remember why I built it." He nodded, then added, "Funny thing, that fence kept them out." But in the end, it brought everyone else together. I glanced back toward the street where neighbors were chatting, kids were drawing chalk dragons on the sidewalk, and the air smelled faintly of barbecue. "Yeah," I said, "not bad for a couple of cedar planks."